looking for escapism, I just want to escape.
Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, in the annals of movie history, there have been some truly memorable villains, and some of them have been quite mentally unstable. And in this modern world where we band around terms like lunatic and psychotic, what do the literal meanings really mean when we apply them to movie villains? And which villains have suffered from psychosis in terms of their presentation, mental state and depictions on screen? Well, join me today as we look at psychosis in movie villains and, through evidence-based discussion and clinical dissection of their presentation, we will look at what psychosis is, how it affects people, and how it has been portrayed when it comes to our movie villains. Oh, and we'll also look at some villains who are not suffering from psychosis and compare and contrast with them so we can get a deeper understanding. Right then, let's crack on. First of all, just what is psychosis? Well, in the most basic of terms, psychosis occurs when an individual loses touch with reality. Psychosis can include hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, and abnormal movements. Now, hallucinations are where someone perceives something that doesn't exist. Delusions are false and fixed beliefs which are often outlandish or simply incongruent, and disorganized speech may manifest as incoherent babbling. Finally, abnormal movements can also come in as lack of normal movements, with things like motionless, which is a state called catatonia. It's important to remember that psychosis is a symptom, not a classifiable disorder in and of itself. Persistent symptoms of psychosis may lead to a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which is a lifelong disorder, or schizoaffective disorder, which lasts months to years, or schizophreniform disorder, which lasts approximately 6 months and then dissipates. Psychosis can also be symptomatic of bipolar disorder, but outside of what we call Axis 1 disorders, psychosis can arise from other sources such as sleep deprivation, alcohol or drugs. Oh, and by the way, when I say Axis 1 disorders, I mean biological mental health disorders. So when we're talking about psychosis, we need to be clear about the loss of touch with reality, beliefs which are out of touch with reality, and presentation which is congruent to a disjointed connection with reality. And these are crucial because when it comes to our villains shortly, we're going to need to cross them onto and off our lists via these facets. Okay, so let's break it down. What exactly are the signs and symptoms of psychosis? And for our villains, they need to be something identifiable in their presentation. So let's list our signs and symptoms of psychosis according to Psychology Today. Number 1, behavioural changes. A full change in behavioural presentation may well be experienced and observed prior to a full psychotic episode. Number 2, withdrawal from friends and social activities. A drop in grades or job performance, or not speaking to people who are friends and family, is an example of this. Number 3, blunted emotion or inappropriate emotion. An inability to think clearly and the sense that something is generally off. Also, suspicions about behaviours of others. Number 4, aggression towards others. Anger and violence targeted without provocation. This can be physical or verbal hostility. Number 5, memory problems and distractibility. Unable to recall things which are unable to be stored in the short-term and long-term memory parts of the brain. Number 6, auditory, visual, gustatory or olfactory hallucinations. This is where a person hears, sees, and in some cases feels, smells or tastes things that do not exist outside of their mind but can feel very real to the person affected by them. A common hallucination is hearing voices. Number 7, delusions. Delusions are fixed, false beliefs which are real and immovable, and where a person has strong beliefs that are not shared by others. A common delusion is someone believing that there's a conspiracy to harm them. Number 8, disordered thinking and speaking. A person's thoughts and ideas come very quickly, which can make their speech fast and confusing, such as mangled syntax, rapid speech, and nonsensical statements. Now, it's important to remember that when it comes to the medical science, the focus for studies on psychosis has so far been very much based in the brain. However, psychosis is multifactorial. So, yes, there are fundamental biological processes that are important for brain function, but these are significantly influenced by psychological and social factors that mediate both brain development and subsequent brain function. So, things like iatrogenic medication effects and isolation can affect the risk of psychosis. There are also associations between genetic endowment and the risk of psychosis, but also factors that are linked to the development of the brain, such as childhood trauma or early separation from a parent. Drugs like cannabis not only increase the risk of psychosis, but also the risk is increased in those who are born or brought up within those environments. And crucially, the literature reports that such risk factors do not operate independently. They interact. The impact of biological factors are significantly influenced by psychological and social factors. A person's risk of developing schizophrenia relies on an interplay between biological, psychological, and social risk factors at individual and ecological levels, which all interact with each other over time. And whilst many believe that there are three main factors of psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, and disordered speech, the National Institute of Mental Health went one step further and defined a total of 5 crucial symptoms of psychosis, which will need to go into our movie villain mix, which are suspiciousness, paranoid ideas, or uneasiness with others, trouble thinking clearly and logically, withdrawing socially and spending a lot more time alone, unusual or overtly intense ideas, strange feelings, or a lack of feelings, a decline in self-care or personal hygiene. Okay, so let's come to our movie villains. And for today's video, we're going to look at the following. For the psychotic, we will discuss Norman Bates from Psycho and Francis Dollarhide from Red Dragon. Then we will contrast our non-psychotic villains, which are the Joker from The Dark Knight and Magneto from the original X-Men, before closing on a debate over John Doe, who is the lead antagonist in the movie Seven. Okay, let's get to Bates first. In the movie Psycho, Marion Crane stumbles across a place called the Bates Motel, where she decides to take a shower before Mr., or is that Mrs., Stabby McStabstab curtails her stay and decides to use her for a knife rack. Anyway, after many more twists and turns, it turns out that the owner of the motel, Norman Bates, has a rather odd relationship with his mother, and this gets even odder when we discover that his mother, spoiler alert, has been dead for a long time, and Norman has now adopted the persona of mother, and not only does he dress up as her, the mother side of this split personality and psychosis is now the dominant frame of reference for Norman. Now, like I said, Norman likes to dress up as mother, and as their relationship wasn't the healthiest when they were alive, the lonely boy internalised mother's harsh critiques into a form of love, and he withdrew from reality, has positive symptoms of psychosis such as auditory hallucinations or mother talking to him, has the negative symptoms of psychosis in terms of withdrawal and a decline in normal functioning, has odd or magical thinking and delusions or fixed beliefs that he is his mother. So already you can see our symptoms of psychosis being applied to Norman and affecting him. Norman has a case for personality being an issue here because he is alone, spending far too much time watching girls rather than having actual sex with them, and has internalised his mother's cruelty and almost atypical love which borders on sexual abuse. However, as he hears his mother's voice and actually dresses up as her so he can play the part of mother, he may have mental capacity, but he definitely has psychosis. It's also worth noting that Norman keeps his mother's corpse upstairs, dresses it, tends to it, and this is a huge withdrawal from reality and a huge show of incongruent and odd behaviour. In the movie Red Dragon, Francis Dollarhide believes he is becoming the Great Red Dragon, and despite being an expert serial killer who removes forensic evidence from his scenes after torturing the family, he honestly believes he is becoming this great red dragon and thinks the tattoo on his back is his first step into transmogrifying into this mythical beast. Dollarhide was taken to his aunt's when he was a very young boy, and he also had a cleft palate, and he was tortured relentlessly by his aunt, where she beat, humiliated and threatened to mutilate his penis every time he wet the bed. So, like Norman Bates, he has a history of trauma imprinted on him. However, whereas Mrs. Bates did love a little too much and too intensely and deprived Norman of normality, Auntie Dollarhide was just cruel. But, like Norman, he has internalised her harsh critiques into his mental schema and personality structure. We even hear her as we step inside his head, calling him a dirty little beast, but hearing her voice isn't necessarily a sign of psychosis on its own, because trauma leaves vivid mental scars and repetitive patterns of feeling like the abuse is visibly happening again and again because the trauma hasn't been processed in the neocortex part of the brain. In emotionally unstable personality disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, victims of abuse often internalise their abuser's voice and repeat scenarios out of sheer terror and lack of control in the real world. They are basically suffering self-re-victimisation, but they can't shift the trauma that is lodged in their brain. Re-experiencing trauma is a crucial part of coping and control, and part of the reason that therapy is so crucial in getting over trauma is that it gives a safe place for these thoughts and unshared feelings and alternate coping mechanisms of dissociation or anger to come out in a safe space. Therefore, despite being physically strong through bodybuilding, Dollarhide is socially and sexually awkward, and his personality is forced to relive, re-experience and go through rituals where he vividly re-experiences his grandmother's voice taunting him from back when he was helpless. No matter how big and how tough he makes himself, he's always that little boy, and apart from smashing mirrors to hide his face, he is never strong enough to overpower Auntie and her mental abuse. So, like we discussed earlier, psychosis isn't just biological. It comes from trauma, prolonged exposure to abuse, and it also comes from social situations. However, psychosis or not, in terms of the voice of his aunt, the voice of the Red Dragon is our real sign of psychosis and, like Norman, a dominant personality which talks to and commands Dollarhide to kill and kill again, and this is what torments him when we meet his blind love interest. The Red Dragon is Dollarhide's true psychosis, and he has a delusional belief that he will become the Red Dragon, or, when fully in love, he believes that eating the picture will stop the great red dragon from taking his true love. So, despite maintaining a life in the Photoshop, Dollarhide's psychosis symptoms are: he is withdrawn from reality. He has the positive symptoms of psychosis, such as hallucinations. He has the negative symptoms of psychosis, such as withdrawal and a decline in functioning. He has odd or magical thinking in terms of the Great Red Dragon, and he holds these delusions or fixed beliefs over what he is going to become. So Norman Bates and Francis Dollarhide are suffering from prolonged episodes of psychosis and are experiencing alterations in their perceptions of reality, and are also having difficulty thinking clearly as you or I would. And psychosis is kind of a triad. It's losing contact with reality, seeing and hearing things such as hallucinations, having delusions and fixed belief, and although other factors come into this triad, it's the essential cornerstone of what we would call psychosis. Okay, let's come to Magneto and the Joker. As I said before, the Joker is specifically from the movie The Dark Knight, and we'll see why these guys don't have psychosis. Magneto, or Erich Lenscher, to give him his correct name, was captured and taken to the concentration camp Auschwitz as a child alongside his mother and father, and whilst there he watched his parents die and underwent the most horrific treatment in one of the worst places human beings have ever constructed. Now grown up with his powers fully formed, Magneto is convinced that humans are beneath mutants and there will be a second Holocaust where mutants have the barcode stamped onto their arms and there will be a war or genocide of his kind. So he decides to enact a plan where he turns humans into mutants with a bizarre machine thingy which emits a 1990s level special effect. So is Magneto delusional and psychotic? Well, no. Magneto's been through a prolonged period of trauma and suffering and has now left him with post-traumatic stress disorder and also paranoia. But unlike paranoia from voices or delusions or imaginary conspiracies, Magneto has a good reason to be paranoid because he is different, powerful, and already the target of the government. So he has a frame of reference where he sees the world through a prism based upon experience and trauma, and he has every reason to fear more concentration camps coming because humans and mutants will always be opposed. Also for Magneto, his powers and experiences and intellect have left him with narcissistic personality disorder. Now, AlaraRogers.net argued Magneto has bipolar affective disorder, but I disagree, and we need the multi-axial model for this. Now remember that bipolar and schizophrenia are biological axis 1 disorders. Personality disorders, like narcissistic personality disorder, are axis 2, and these are thought of as the mind's immune system. Mental white blood cells, if you will, which manage the axis 3 and axis 4 medical conditions and social stresses of the real world. Magneto has watched his people die in concentration camps. He then found his gifts around the same time he was hitting puberty and, through his intellect, rose into a position where he could enact vengeance and power. He recruits lesser intellect mutants, but mutants with power nonetheless, and prepares a small army. Remember, I'm focusing on the first X-Men movie here, the first one, not X2 or The Dreadful Last Stand or the recent prequels. Magneto hates humans and thinks they are beneath him and considers himself the pioneer of mutant kind. There is no empathy towards humans and he sees them as ants. He's a classic narcissist in terms of grandiosity and demands to be recognised. However, he does groom mutants, but he grooms them with flattery. But that flattery is only interested in them if they can help him. If they can't, he isn't interested and they're also beneath him. Remember, personality is the pattern of characteristics across the whole matrix of the persona, and personality disorders must be problematic, pervasive, and permanent. So for me, Magneto has a personality disorder which goes alongside his PTSD and not psychosis. The Joker, on the other hand, has antisocial personality disorder and is a psychopath. He is reckless, has no empathy, has temper outbursts, is impulsive, cons others for money and power, lies repeatedly, and has a failure to abide by social norms. Now, many fan theories place the Joker as a Gulf War veteran who was tortured or has a background of post-traumatic stress disorder, but we will never know, and that's the point. However, the scars on his face aren't natural and were clearly a result of mutilation, so whether the Joker did it to himself, or indeed it was his father, who was a drinker, as we are told in the first hypothesized story, does this really matter? And the reason I say this is because the Joker isn't psychotic, he's just a psychopath, and these are different. Again, on the antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy continuum, he is on an axis 2 personality disorder and not psychosis from a biological mental illness. Maybe it was a mob boss who cut him up, as the Joker has a thing about the mob which runs through the entire film and his desire to squash them and get to the top. But much like all antisocial personality patients do, he is competitive and takes escalating risks without heed for his own safety, and that is why he is in Gotham, because the Batman represents the ultimate challenge. Either way, his past mutilation has left him with some PTSD, Whatever doesn't kill you simply makes you stranger, he tells us, and also a severe personality disorder. Like I said, problematic, pervasive, and permanent. The Joker's behaviour is ingrained and immovable. Coming back to psychosis, it's important to remember that it affects the way your brain processes information. It causes you to lose touch with reality. You might see, hear, or believe things which aren't real, and psychosis is a symptom, and it isn't an illness. It can be triggered by a mental illness, a physical injury, or generally an illness, substance abuse, or extreme stress and trauma, but psychosis isn't a diagnosed mental illness, it is just a symptom of one. However, both Magneto and the Joker are in touch with reality, know what they are doing, and their quests are through a frame of reference based on past experience, and their behaviour is congruent to the pervasive problems of their personality disorders. Finally, we come to John Doe from the movie Seven, and he's a trickier case because with his apartment full of rambling notebooks, a giant religious cross, a collection of body parts and photographs of his mutilations, also the repeated self-mutilation of his fingers, and a complex quest to make himself famous so he can be remembered across time and history, he is a mixture of comorbid personality disorder and severe mental illness. He is insane but very clever. He believes that his work is from a higher power, yet it remains very self-centered, and he is a dyad of opposites and a dichotomy of both developmental axis 2 personality disorders and axis 1 clinical illness. It's also worth noting that, like the Joker, his backstory is never known and nebulous, and that's crucial because it makes diagnosing a little bit more tricky. John Doe does have emotionally unstable personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, but he also has the control and grandiosity of narcissistic personality disorder. Yet his belief that he was called upon to complete this mission, as he alludes in the car ride with Mills and Somerset, and also his religious beliefs about sin and the collapse of society, suggest a strong case for schizophrenia. However, being religious isn't a case for mental illness, and if it were, then half the planet would be affected by it. And faith is a natural and understandable method of both support and coping through times of difficulty, and a lifestyle which is decent and productive for many people. However, as Doe feels he's on a mission to highlight sin and potentially listening to voices telling him to commit his crimes, his faith comes under the territory of psychotic symptoms, but the faith isn't the cause of his illness. Instead, his faith becomes a conduit for his extreme cruelty, violence, and social commentary via his crusade against the deadly sins. He's also withdrawn from reality. He has strong negative symptoms of psychosis. He lives alone, writes alone. His entire life is based around being by himself. He doesn't seem to have a job, although he's independently wealthy. So he has negative symptoms. He has withdrawal. He has fixed beliefs. He has delusions. It's also worth noting that not all delusions are delusions, and the reason I say that is because many people say conspiracy theories are delusions. Not always. Some conspiracy theories have been exposed as the truth. Again, take the post office scandal in this country, where many postmaster generals took their own lives or went to prison for theft, which was actually a computer error. All the postmaster generals kept saying it's the computer, and this was labelled as a conspiracy theory or a delusion. But it wasn't. It was fact. The difference is for that is that that has now been proved. The error in the post office has been proved, and people are now being held accountable. However, conspiracy theories like saying someone's going to come back to life, or someone's going to reappear who's dead and has been dead for many years, that leans more into delusions because it's something that can't be proved, and self-evidently and objectively isn't going to happen, because if you're already dead, it's really hard to come back to life. Now, psychosis can happen to anyone, and it's estimated that 3 out of every 100 people will suffer from an episode of psychosis. However, most episodes pass, and only as few as 25% of those cases will go on to have lifelong problems. And whilst there are effects on the brain, psychosis can usually be managed with medication. However, For Francis Dollarhide and Norman Bates, their problems have been left far too long and their delusions are now fixed, and even if there was an improvement in their presentation, they aren't really safe to be left on the streets and intermingle with society. The point here is that when it comes to movies and villains, well-written ones have all the facets and symptoms and are believable because of it, and we shouldn't be afraid to have more villains with complexity and dynamic or comorbid mental health problems, because suffering from psychosis doesn't make you evil or a serial killer. But when movies are portraying someone with psychosis or personality disorders, then authenticity is crucial for the story to be immersive and the character to be believable. Removing all the ridiculousness in the world about offending people, you have to take everything into context and everything must have nuance. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. I really hope you enjoyed our deep dive into psychosis, and remember, psychology is cool. Please like, share and subscribe, and I say subscribe most importantly because without you guys and gals, I'm just rambling into a void, and the more interest I have, the more videos I can make. Also, please feel free to leave a comment because health debate is always great on here and I love a good in-depth discussion. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.